Sandra Green stood in her cozy living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the morning. The early light filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow on the photos that lined the mantle. Memories of her son, Michael, from his college graduation to the launch of his first tech startup. Today, she was traveling to San Francisco to visit him, a trip that filled her with both excitement and a bit of nervousness. Michael had insisted on flying her out in style, booking her a business class ticket to make the journey as comfortable as possible. Sandra appreciated the gesture, though she felt slightly out of place with the luxury. She wasn't used to such treatment, preferring to keep things simple and modest. But this trip was special. Her son had achieved so much, and she wanted to be there to celebrate his success. As she packed her suitcase, carefully folding her clothes and tucking away small gifts for Michael, Sandra couldn't help but smile. Her son had always been ambitious, ever since he was a little boy tinkering with computers. Now he was one of Silicon Valley's rising stars, and she couldn't be prouder of the man he had become. With everything ready, Sandra took a deep breath and glanced around her home one last time before heading out. This trip was not just about visiting her son, it was a chance to reconnect and share in the joy of his accomplishments. She was ready for whatever lay ahead, excited to see where this journey would take her. Sandra arrived at the airport with plenty of time to spare, her nerves tempered by the excitement of the journey ahead. She navigated the bustling terminal, her eyes scanning the signs until she found her way to the check-in counter. The agent greeted her politely, though Sandra noticed a slight hesitation when she handed over her business class ticket. It was a small moment, but one that reminded her of the assumptions people often made based on appearances. After checking in, Sandra made her way through security and into the airport lounge. The space was filled with travelers dressed in business attire, their conversations a low hum of activity. Sandra, dressed comfortably but neatly, took a seat by the window and watched as planes taxied on the runway. She felt a mix of pride and anxiety, knowing that this trip represented not just a visit, but a milestone in her son's life. The announcement for her flight came over the intercom, and Sandra gathered her belongings, feeling the familiar flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. As she boarded the plane, she was greeted by a flight attendant who directed her to her seat in the business class cabin. The seat was plush and spacious, a far cry from the coach seats she was used to. Sandra settled in, trying to relax and enjoy the comfort that her son had insisted on providing. As the plane began to fill, Sandra couldn't help but notice the glances from other passengers. Some looked curious, others indifferent, but a few seemed surprised to see her in business class. She felt the weight of those looks, but chose to focus on the reason for her trip, seeing Michael and sharing in his success. This was a journey she had earned through years of hard work and sacrifice, and she was determined to savor every moment. Seated in her comfortable business class seat, Sandra allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the long hours she had worked, the sacrifices she had made to support Michael's education and dreams. Her heart swelled with pride knowing that all her efforts had paid off. Michael was living his dream, and she was about to witness the fruits of that labor firsthand. But along with the pride, there was a nagging anxiety that she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the flight that unsettled her. It was the way people often treated her in spaces like this. Sandra was no stranger to the subtle prejudices and microaggressions that came with being a black woman in predominantly white, affluent environments. She had faced it before, and while she had learned to navigate it with grace, it still stung every time. As the plane began its ascent, Sandra looked out the window trying to calm her nerves. She reminded herself that this trip was about celebrating Michael's success, not about the perceptions of strangers. But even as she tried to focus on the positive, she couldn't entirely shake the feeling of being out of place, as if she was being silently judged by those around her. Sandra took a deep breath and closed her eyes, reminding herself that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. She had worked hard, raised a successful son, and deserved every bit of comfort and recognition this trip promised. With that thought, she settled into her seat, determined to enjoy the journey despite the undercurrent of anxiety. As boarding continued, Sandra observed the flow of passengers entering the business class cabin. She noticed a variety of people, businessmen engrossed in their phones, couples chatting quietly, and a few solo travelers like herself. Despite her attempts to blend in, Sandra couldn't ignore the occasional glances and the slight shift in demeanor from the flight attendants as they passed by her seat. One of the flight attendants, a tall woman with a professional smile, approached Sandra and asked if she needed anything. The interaction was polite but lacked the warmth that Sandra had seen directed towards other passengers. Sandra requested a glass of water, and as the attendant moved away, Sandra couldn't help but feel the undercurrent of distance in the exchange. As she sat back and tried to relax, Sandra noticed a couple seated across the aisle, whispering to each other while glancing in her direction. Their expressions were unreadable, but the subtle scrutiny was unmistakable. Sandra felt a familiar pang of discomfort, but chose to focus on her book, determined not to let the actions of others ruin her experience. The cabin filled with the quiet sounds of passengers settling in, and Sandra found herself reflecting on the assumptions people often made about her. She had faced such judgments many times before, yet each instance left a mark. Despite the discomfort, Sandra reminded herself of the reason for her trip, to see Michael and share in the joy of his success. That thought brought a small smile to her face, giving her the strength to push aside the uneasy feelings and look forward to the journey ahead. As the plane prepared for a takeoff, Sandra couldn't ignore the subtle but noticeable glances from other passengers. They were quick, often fleeting, but their intent was clear. Some passengers seemed curious, as if trying to place her in a context that made sense to them. Others appeared slightly puzzled, as though her presence in business class was out of place in their minds. Sandra was no stranger to these types of looks. She had encountered them in various forms throughout her life, whether in upscale restaurants, at corporate events, or even in her son's tech company offices. It was the silent, often unconscious assumption that she didn't belong, that she was somehow out of place. This silent judgment was something she had grown accustomed to, but it never became easier to bear. Despite the discomfort, Sandra maintained her composure. She had learned long ago that responding to such things with grace was often the best approach. After all, she knew her own worth and the hard work that had brought her to this point. She had every right to be here, enjoying the comfort of the business class cabin as much as anyone else. As the plane ascended into the sky, Sandra turned her attention to the in-flight magazine in front of her, trying to distract herself from the feeling of being watched. She reminded herself of the purpose of her trip, to celebrate Michael's success and share in the joy of his accomplishments. With that thought in mind, she resolved not to let the silent judgments of strangers dampen her spirits. Sandra settled deeper into her plush seat, trying to push the uneasy feelings aside. The business class cabin was designed for comfort, with wide seats, ample legroom, and personalized service. She adjusted her seat, feeling the soft leather against her back, and tried to let herself enjoy the luxury that Michael had insisted she experience. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight drinks and ensuring that passengers were comfortable. Sandra noticed that while some passengers were greeted with warm smiles and engaging conversation, her own interactions were polite but distant. The flight attendant who had served her earlier returned with a glass of water, setting it on her tray table with a perfunctory nod. Sandra sipped the water slowly, her mind drifting back to Michael. He had always been so thoughtful, ensuring that she had the best of everything, even when it meant spending money that she knew he had worked hard to earn. This trip was no exception. Michael had insisted on booking her a business class ticket, wanting her to travel in comfort and style. Sandra smiled, knowing how much it meant to him that she was coming to visit. As the plane cruised at altitude, Sandra leaned back and closed her eyes, trying to relax. The hum of the engines was soothing, and she allowed herself to drift into a light sleep. But even in this relaxed state, the awareness of the subtle treatment she was receiving lingered at the back of her mind. It was a reminder of the silent barriers she still faced, even in spaces that should have been welcoming. As the flight progressed, Sandra couldn't help but notice the indifferent treatment she received from the flight attendants. While they attended to the needs of other passengers with a certain level of attentiveness and friendliness, their interactions with Sandra were brisk and impersonal. Her requests were met with curt responses, and she was served with a mechanical politeness that felt more like an obligation than genuine service. Sandra asked for a blanket, and the attendant handed it to her without making eye contact, quickly moving on to the next passenger. She felt the sting of the slight, recognizing it as another subtle form of discrimination she had encountered so many times before. It wasn't overt, but the message was clear. She wasn't seen as worthy of the same warmth and hospitality extended to others. Despite the discomfort, Sandra maintained her dignity. She had long learned to carry herself with grace in the face of such treatment. She reminded herself that she was here because she deserved to be, and that her presence was just as valid as anyone else's. The indifferent service could not diminish the joy she felt about seeing her son. Still, the experience left a mark. Sandra found herself retreating inward, trying to ignore the atmosphere around her and focus on the upcoming reunion with Michael. She knew that the way she was being treated said more about the flight attendant's biases than it did about her, but it didn't make the experience any less disheartening. As the hours passed, the indifference of the flight attendants became more pronounced. Sandra asked for a glass of water, and the attendant brought it without a word, barely acknowledging her presence. When she requested a snack, the response was similarly curt, delivered with a tight smile that barely masked the disinterest. Sandra couldn't help but contrast this treatment with the way other passengers were being served. She observed as the flight attendants engaged in friendly banter with some passengers, offering additional drinks and snacks without being asked. The difference was stark, and it reinforced the feeling that she was being singled out for reasons that had nothing to do with the service itself. Despite her growing discomfort, Sandra remained polite and composed. She knew that reacting angrily would only reinforce whatever stereotypes the attendants might hold. Instead, she chose to remain calm, refusing to let their behavior affect her mood. She had faced worse in her life and had always emerged stronger. Sandra turned her attention back to her book, trying to lose herself in the story and forget about the way she was being treated. But the curt responses and cold demeanor of the flight attendants left a lingering feeling of alienation. It was a reminder that no matter how much success her son had achieved or how far she had come, there were still places where she was made to feel unwelcome. As the flight continued, Sandra couldn't help but overhear a conversation between a couple seated across the aisle. They were speaking in low tones, but the words carried in the quiet cabin. "It's strange seeing someone like her in business class," the woman whispered to her companion, who nodded in agreement. "I wonder what she does to afford it," the man added, a note of skepticism in his voice. Sandra felt a flush of anger and embarrassment rise within her. She had dealt with similar comments before, veiled insinuations that she didn't belong in certain spaces, that her presence was somehow an anomaly. It was a painful reminder of the assumptions people made based on her appearance, without knowing anything about her life or achievements. She considered saying something, but then decided against it. Sandra knew that engaging would likely lead to a confrontation she didn't want to have. Instead, she took a deep breath and tried to let the comments roll off her back. She had faced far worse and had always found a way to rise above it. Still, the words lingered in her mind, dampening the excitement she had felt about the trip. It was a stark reminder of the biases that still existed, even in places that should have been above such things. Sandra resolved to focus on the positive, her upcoming reunion with Michael, and not let the ignorance of a few passengers ruin her journey. Despite the hurtful comments and the chilly treatment from the flight attendants, Sandra remained composed. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain her dignity in the face of adversity, a trait she had instilled in Michael as well. She knew that reacting emotionally to the ignorance of others would only give them power over her. Sandra took a deep breath and reminded herself of her purpose. She was on this flight to see her son, to celebrate his incredible achievements and share in his joy. Nothing, not the indifferent service, nor the insensitive remarks, could take that away from her. She closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on the excitement of the reunion that awaited her. When she opened her eyes again, she was determined not to let the negativity of others affect her. Sandra adjusted her seat and returned to her book, forcing herself to concentrate on the words and immerse herself in the story. It wasn't easy, but she knew that dwelling on the hurt would only ruin her mood. As the plane continued its journey toward San Francisco, Sandra found comfort in her own resilience. She had faced challenges and prejudices before, and she knew she would face them again. But she also knew that her strength lay in her ability to rise above it all, to hold her head high and remain true to herself. This trip was about celebrating Michael, and she wouldn't let anything spoil that. As the plane cruised high above the clouds, Sandra's thoughts drifted back to similar moments in her life, times when she had been judged unfairly or treated differently because of her race. She recalled the subtle glances in upscale stores, the whispered comments at corporate events, and the times when she had been asked if she was lost in places where others assumed she didn't belong. These experiences had shaped Sandra's resilience. They had taught her the importance of maintaining her dignity, no matter how others chose to perceive her. She had worked hard her entire life, not just for herself, but to ensure that her son had the opportunities she had to fight for. Every instance of prejudice she faced only strengthened her resolve to succeed and to rise above it all. Sandra thought about the lessons she had passed on to Michael. She had always encouraged him to excel, to never let others define his worth, and to be proud of his heritage. Now, as a successful tech entrepreneur, Michael was living proof of her efforts. He had faced his own challenges, but had emerged stronger and more determined, just like his mother. Reflecting on these moments gave Sandra a renewed sense of purpose. She was reminded that, while the world could be unkind and prejudiced, she had the power to choose how she responded. The past had taught her to be resilient, and she knew she had to draw on that strength now. No matter what happened during this flight, she would not allow it to diminish her sense of self-worth or the joy she felt in seeing her son. As Sandra continued to reflect, her mind wandered back to her childhood, growing up in a time and place where racial discrimination was more overt. She remembered the whites-only signs she had seen as a young girl, the segregated schools, and the harsh realities her parents had faced. These memories, though painful, had shaped her understanding of the world and fueled her desire to create a better future for Michael. She recalled stories her mother had told her about the civil rights movement and the fight for equality. Her mother had been a strong woman, firm in her belief that change was possible through persistence and courage. These stories had left a deep imprint on Sandra, instilling in her a sense of responsibility to stand up against injustice, even in the small, everyday moments. Sandra also thought about the challenges she had faced in her career. As one of the few Black women in her field, she had often been underestimated and overlooked. But instead of letting it defeat her, she had used it as motivation to work harder, proving her worth time and again. These experiences had not only made her stronger, but had also prepared her for the challenges she now faced. As she reflected on these memories, Sandra felt a deep sense of connection to the generations of strong Black women who had come before her. They had paved the way for her, and now she was paving the way for her son. The challenges she faced today were part of a larger, ongoing struggle, and she was determined to honor that legacy by continuing to fight for respect and equality. The memories of past struggles and triumphs gave Sandra the strength she needed to maintain her composure. She knew that the way she carried herself in this moment was a reflection not just of her own dignity, but of the dignity of all those who had come before her. The indifferent treatment from the flight attendants and the insensitive comments from other passengers could not shake her sense of self. Sandra adjusted her posture, sitting up a little straighter in her seat. She reminded herself that dignity was not about how others treated you, but about how you chose to respond. She had faced prejudice before and would undoubtedly face it again, but she would never let it define her or dictate her actions. As the flight continued, Sandra became more determined to rise above the negativity. She refused to let the behavior of others rob her of the joy she felt about seeing her son. Michael's success was a testament to everything she had worked for, and that was something to be celebrated, not overshadowed by the ignorance of strangers. By the time the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for landing, Sandra had regained her sense of calm. She had faced a difficult situation with grace and dignity, and she knew that whatever awaited her in San Francisco, she was ready to meet it with the same strength. She took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of peace as the plane began its descent. The flight seemed to stretch on forever, with the discomfort of the earlier encounters lingering in Sandra's mind. She tried to distract herself by watching a movie and flipping through the in-flight magazine, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. Every interaction with the flight attendants reminded her of the subtle ways in which she had been marginalized during this journey. The other passengers continued to keep to themselves, and Sandra found solace in the solitude. She took out her journal, something she often carried with her on trips, and began to write. Putting her thoughts on paper helped her process the emotions she was feeling, the frustration, the hurt, but also the resolve to continue moving forward with grace. As the hours passed, Sandra allowed herself to daydream about the reunion with Michael. She imagined the look of pride on his face when he saw her, the warmth of his embrace, and the joy of being together after so much time apart. These thoughts brought a smile to her face, reminding her of the love and support that awaited her on the other side of this flight. Finally, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent into San Francisco. Sandra put away her journal, took a deep breath, and prepared herself for the landing. Despite the challenges of the flight, she felt a sense of accomplishment in having navigated it with dignity. Now she was ready to focus on the positive, knowing that the best part of her journey was still to come. As the plane began its descent, the subtle humiliations Sandra had endured throughout the flight weighed heavily on her mind. Each instance, from the indifferent service to the whispered comments, had chipped away at her sense of ease. She had done her best to maintain her composure, but the cumulative effect of these microaggressions left her feeling drained. Sandra adjusted her seatbelt and gazed out the window, watching the landscape of San Francisco come into view. The city's skyline, usually a sight of excitement and anticipation, now brought mixed emotions. She was eager to see her son, but the memories of the flight made it difficult to shake the lingering feelings of frustration and hurt. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for landing, and once again, Sandra noticed the difference in their treatment of her compared to other passengers. While they chatted warmly with some, offering last-minute comforts, their interactions with Sandra were brief and impersonal. It was as if they had already made up their minds about her, long before the flight had even begun. Despite the hurtful treatment, Sandra reminded herself of the importance of rising above it. She had faced worse and had always emerged stronger. As the plane touched down on the runway, she took a deep breath, focusing on the positive. She was minutes away from seeing Michael, and that thought alone was enough to lift her spirits, if only slightly. The plane touched down smoothly at San Francisco International Airport, the familiar thud of the landing gear a welcome sound to Sandra's ears. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, she felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. Despite the discomfort of the flight, she was eager to see her son and embrace the joy that awaited her. When the seatbelt sign was turned off, passengers began to gather their belongings. Sandra moved at her own pace, not in a rush to exit the plane. She noticed the way the flight attendants smiled warmly at other passengers, thanking them for flying and wishing them a pleasant day. When Sandra approached, the smiles faded slightly, and the words felt more mechanical than genuine. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air hit her face, and she breathed deeply, grateful to be off the plane. The bustling energy of the airport greeted her, a stark contrast to the confined, uncomfortable atmosphere of the flight. Sandra straightened her shoulders, determined to put the experience behind her and focus on the positive. Her steps quickened as she made her way through the terminal, eager to see Michael. The thought of his warm embrace and the pride she felt in his accomplishments filled her with renewed energy. The flight had been challenging, but now she was on solid ground, ready to step into a moment of celebration and joy. As Sandra walked through the terminal, she couldn't help but notice the curious glances from a few passengers who had shared her flight. It was as if they were still trying to place her, to make sense of her presence in business class. Some looked away quickly when she met their eyes, while others continued to stare, their expressions a mix of curiosity and lingering judgment. Sandra kept her head held high, refusing to let these final glances affect her. She had dealt with enough on the flight, and she was determined to leave those negative experiences behind. Her thoughts were focused on Michael now, on the reunion that was just moments away. As she approached the baggage claim area, Sandra caught sight of her reflection in a large window. She saw a woman who had endured much but remained unbroken. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, and her resolve stronger than ever. Sandra knew that the way people looked at her said more about their own biases than it did about her worth. With a final, resolute glance around the terminal, Sandra turned her attention back to the task at hand, retrieving her luggage and finding Michael. The thought of seeing her son brought a genuine smile to her face, one that erased the remnants of discomfort from the flight. She was ready to embrace the moment of joy and celebration that awaited her. As Sandra stepped into the bustling arrivals area, her eyes scanned the crowd for Michael. Instead, she saw a well-dressed chauffeur holding a sign with her name on it. The sleek, black limousine, parked just outside the terminal, caught her attention immediately. Standing out amidst the standard taxis and shuttles, surprised and touched by the gesture, Sandra approached the chauffeur, who greeted her with a respectful nod. "Miss Green, Mr. Green has arranged for your transportation," he said, his tone polite and professional. Sandra smiled, appreciating the care and attention to detail that Michael had put into making her arrival special. As the chauffeur took her luggage and guided her to the car, Sandra noticed the stares of some of the passengers who had shared her flight. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to shock, realizing that the woman they had subtly judged was someone of significance. The luxurious limousine and the chauffeur's attentiveness were clear indicators that she was no ordinary passenger. Sandra entered the car, sinking into the plush leather seat with a sigh of relief. The tension of the flight began to melt away as she was enveloped in the comfort and luxury of the limousine. She knew that in just a few moments she would be reunited with Michael, and the thought filled her with warmth and anticipation. As the limousine pulled away from the terminal, Sandra felt a sense of calm washing over her. The stress of the flight faded as the car smoothly navigated through the airport's exit. Just as they turned onto the main road, Sandra noticed another car approaching, a sleek, black luxury sedan. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized the driver. Michael, her son, had arrived to personally welcome her. He pulled up alongside the limousine, flashing a wide smile through the window before signaling the chauffeur to stop. The cars came to a halt, and Michael stepped out, looking every bit the successful entrepreneur he had become, confident, poised, and impeccably dressed. Sandra's eyes welled up with tears of joy and pride as she exited the limousine. Michael was already approaching her with open arms, his expression filled with the love and admiration that had always defined their relationship. "Mom!" he called out, his voice filled with warmth as he enveloped her in a tight embrace. The airport's hustle and bustle seemed to fade away as mother and son shared this tender moment. Sandra could feel the strength and success radiating from Michael, a testament to all the hard work and sacrifice they had both endured to reach this point. As they pulled back slightly, Michael looked into her eyes with a smile. "I'm so glad you're here," he said, and in that moment, Sandra knew that every challenge she had faced was worth it. As Sandra and Michael embraced, the realization of their connection began to dawn on the passengers and crew who had shared the flight with her. The whispers started almost immediately, as people recognized Michael's face from news articles and television interviews. The tech entrepreneur, known for his innovative contributions to the industry, was not just any passenger. He was someone of significant influence. The flight attendants who had served Sandra looked on in disbelief, their expressions shifting from indifference to shock. The passengers who had made insensitive comments exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the truth of who Sandra was. The stunning revelation that this humble woman was the mother of one of Silicon Valley's most prominent figures left them reeling. Michael, ever perceptive, noticed the shift in atmosphere around them. He glanced at the flight attendants and passengers, his expression unreadable. But he chose not to address them directly. Instead, he focused on his mother, guiding her to the limousine with a protective arm around her shoulders. His actions spoke volumes. Sandra was someone to be respected and cherished, regardless of the assumptions others had made. As the limousine door closed behind them, the realization of their mistake hung heavy in the air for those who had judged Sandra. The revelation of her son's identity served as a powerful reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that every person deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they were perceived. As Sandra and Michael settled into the limousine, preparing to leave the airport, they were approached by one of the flight attendants from the plane. Her face was flushed with embarrassment, and her demeanor was markedly different from the indifferent attitude she had displayed earlier. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice filled with remorse. "Miss Green, I just wanted to apologize for any discomfort you experienced during the flight." Sandra looked at the flight attendant, her expression calm but reserved. She appreciated the gesture, but the apology felt too late. coming only after the attendant had realized who her son was. Michael watched the exchange closely, noting the tension in his mother's posture and the awkwardness in the attendant's tone. The flight attendant continued, her words rushed and slightly panicked. "I hope you can understand that it wasn't intentional, and we never meant to make you feel uncomfortable. We're very sorry for any offense caused." Sandra nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology, but her silence spoke volumes. The damage had already been done, and words alone couldn't erase the hurtful experiences she had endured during the flight. Michael stepped in, his tone measured but firm. "Thank you for your apology," he said, his gaze steady on the attendant. "I hope this serves as a reminder to treat all passengers with the same respect and care, regardless of who they are." The flight attendant nodded quickly, clearly eager to leave the uncomfortable situation behind. As she walked away, Sandra and Michael exchanged a look, understanding that while the apology was appreciated, the real lesson was in how people choose to treat others. Sandra sat quietly in the limousine after the flight attendant walked away, her thoughts a swirl of emotions. The apology had been awkward and clearly driven by the revelation of Michael's identity, rather than a genuine recognition of her worth. Despite this, Sandra chose to respond with the grace and dignity that had always defined her. She turned to Michael, offering a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," she said softly, placing her hand on his. "I've faced worse, and I know how to rise above it. What matters now is that I'm here with you." Michael squeezed her hand gently, his eyes reflecting both admiration and understanding. He knew how strong his mother was, how many challenges she had overcome with quiet resilience. Sandra's ability to maintain her composure in the face of adversity was something Michael deeply respected. He had learned so much from her over the years about strength, integrity, and the importance of treating others with kindness, regardless of their status or appearance. Seeing her handle the situation with such poise only reinforced the values she had instilled in him. As the limousine began to move, Sandra looked out the window at the city passing by, allowing herself to let go of the negative experiences from the flight. She was determined not to let them overshadow the joy of being reunited with her son. With a deep breath, she centered herself in the present moment, ready to focus on the positive and leave the rest behind. While Sandra was ready to move on, Michael couldn't shake the frustration he felt about how his mother had been treated. He had seen the shift in behavior once the flight attendants and passengers realized who she was, and it angered him that her dignity had only been recognized after her connection to him was revealed. It wasn't the first time he had seen his mother face such discrimination, but it never got easier to witness. Determined to address the issue, Michael decided to speak out. As the limousine made its way through the city, he pulled out his phone and began drafting a post for his social media platforms. Michael knew the power of his influence and felt a responsibility to use it to highlight the everyday prejudices that people like his mother faced. In his post, Michael shared the story of what had happened on the flight, carefully omitting any names or identifying details to protect his mother's privacy. He focused on the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity, regardless of their background or perceived status. He also called for better training and awareness in service industries, urging others to reflect on their own biases and strive to do better. As he finished typing, Michael looked at his mother, who was resting her eyes, clearly tired from the day's events. He knew she wouldn't have wanted him to make a big deal out of the situation, but he also knew that staying silent wouldn't sit right with him. With a deep breath, he hit post, sending his message out to his millions of followers. Michael hoped that by sharing their experience, he could spark a conversation that would lead to real change. As the limousine smoothly made its way through the streets of San Francisco, Sandra noticed the change in Michael's demeanor after he posted his message. He was still by her side, but she could see the wheels turning in his mind, processing everything that had happened. She appreciated his protective nature, but she also knew he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, always striving to make a difference. Sandra reached over and touched his hand, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Michael," she said softly, "you don't have to take on every battle. I'm okay, really. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and unfortunately, it may not be the last. But I've learned how to handle it, and I don't want you to carry this burden." Michael looked at his mother, his expression a mix of admiration and frustration. I know, Mom, but it's not right. You shouldn't have to deal with this. No one should. Sandra smiled gently, understanding his need to stand up for her and for others who face similar injustices. You're right, she agreed. But what's important is how we respond. You've already done so much, Michael, and I'm so proud of the man you've become. The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment, reflecting on the journey they had both been on. Sandra's as a mother and mentor, and Michael's as a son, and now a leader in his own right. The challenges they had faced had only strengthened their bond and deepened their mutual respect. Sandra knew that whatever the world threw at them, they would always have each other's support. As the limousine continued its journey through the city, the conversation between Sandra and Michael shifted to lighter topics. They talked about his work, the projects he was passionate about, and the new developments in his company. Sandra listened with pride, amazed by how far he had come. Despite the earlier tension, she was grateful for this time to reconnect with her son. Michael also asked about his mother's life back home, wanting to know how she was spending her time and if she had any new hobbies or interests. Sandra chuckled, telling him about the gardening club she had joined and the new recipes she had been trying out. She loved that Michael was always interested in the details of her life, never too busy to care about the little things that brought her joy. They also reminisced about the past, sharing stories from Michael's childhood and laughing at the memories they held dear. It was a conversation filled with warmth and nostalgia, a reminder of the strong bond they shared. Sandra felt her spirits lift as they laughed together, the earlier stress of the day fading into the background. As they neared Michael's home, Sandra felt a sense of contentment settle over her. The challenges of the flight were behind her, and now she could focus on the reason she had come, to spend time with her son and celebrate his success. The ride had given them both a chance to reconnect, and Sandra was reminded of how deeply they understood and supported each other. Once they arrived at Michael's modern, spacious home, Sandra and Michael settled into the living room, continuing their conversation. The ambience was relaxed, with the soft lighting and comfortable furniture providing a welcome contrast to the sterile environment of the plane. Michael offered his mother a cup of tea, which she accepted gratefully, savoring the warmth and comfort it brought. As they sipped their tea, the conversation naturally turned back to the incident on the flight. Sandra, now feeling more at ease, opened up about how the experience had affected her. She admitted that while she had maintained her composure, the treatment she received had been hurtful and frustrating. I've been dealing with this my whole life, she said, her voice steady but tinged with resignation. It's not just about this one flight. It's about the way people see us and the assumptions they make. Michael listened intently, his frustration growing as he absorbed her words. He felt a deep sense of injustice that his mother, a woman he admired so much, had to endure such indignities. It's not right, Mom, he said, shaking his head. You deserve so much better. We all do. Sandra nodded, understanding his anger, but also knowing that this was a reality they had to face. They discussed the importance of using these experiences to drive change. Sandra encouraged Michael to continue using his platform to speak out against discrimination and to advocate for those who didn't have a voice. You have the power to make a difference, Michael, she said, her eyes full of pride, and I know you will. Michael nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He was determined to turn this negative experience into a catalyst for positive change. The next morning, as Sandra and Michael enjoyed breakfast together, the impact of Michael's social media post began to unfold. Overnight, the story of their flight experience had gained significant attention online. A well-known blogger had picked up the post and written a detailed article about the incident, emphasizing the broader issues of racial prejudice and the need for change in service industries. The article quickly went viral, sparking widespread discussion and debate across various social media platforms. People shared their own experiences of discrimination, and the conversation expanded beyond just the airline industry to include other areas where implicit bias and unequal treatment persisted. The story of Sandra's flight had struck a chord with many, resonating deeply with those who had faced similar challenges. Michael watched the response with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was glad that the story was raising awareness and prompting important conversations. On the other hand, He felt a pang of sadness that his mother's experience was just one example of a much larger problem. He knew that while the attention might lead to change, it was unfortunate that such incidents were still so common. Sandra, ever the optimist, saw the positive side of the situation. "Maybe this will help open some eyes," she said, smiling gently at her son. "Sometimes it takes a personal story to make people really see what's going on." Michael nodded, knowing that his mother's grace and resilience were part of what made the story so powerful. Together, they hoped that the attention would lead to meaningful discussions and, ultimately, real change. As the day progressed, the public reaction to the blog post and Michael's social media update continued to grow. News outlets began to pick up the story, framing it within the larger context of systemic racism and the everyday discrimination faced by Black individuals. The response was overwhelming, with many expressing their outrage at Sandra's treatment and calling for greater accountability from service industries. Sandra received numerous messages of support, both from people she knew and from strangers who had read about her experience. Many shared their own stories of similar mistreatment, creating a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. Sandra was touched by the outpouring of empathy and felt a renewed sense of hope that her experience could contribute to a broader movement for change. Michael, too, was inundated with messages, many from fellow entrepreneurs and public figures who offered their support and pledged to use their platforms to advocate for equality. He was heartened to see that the story was inspiring others to speak out and take action. It reaffirmed his belief in the power of storytelling to affect change and encouraged him to continue his advocacy work. However, the story also attracted criticism from some quarters, with a few questioning whether the incident was being blown out of proportion. Sandra and Michael knew that these reactions were part of the challenge of addressing deep-seated biases, and that not everyone would be ready to confront their own prejudices. Still, they remained focused on the positive impact the story was having and the important conversations it was sparking. In the days following the viral blog post, Michael began to take more concrete steps to turn the attention into action. He reached out to leaders in the tech industry, encouraging them to examine their own company cultures and to implement training programs aimed at addressing unconscious bias and promoting inclusivity. Michael knew that real change had to start at the top, and he was committed to using his influence to lead by example. Michael also collaborated with organizations that focused on social justice and equality, offering to support their initiatives both financially and through public speaking engagements. He knew that his platform could help amplify these efforts, and he was eager to lend his voice to causes that aligned with his values. His mother's experience had reignited his passion for advocacy, and he was determined to make a difference. Sandra watched her son's efforts with pride, knowing that her own strength and resilience had helped shape the man he had become. She knew that Michael was doing more than just reacting to the incident. He was using it as a springboard to create lasting change. Sandra continued to support him, offering her wisdom and perspective as he navigated the complexities of advocacy work. Together, Sandra and Michael made public appearances, speaking at events and participating in discussions about the importance of equality and respect. Their story became a powerful example of how personal experiences could fuel broader social movements. Michael's advocacy work, inspired by his mother's grace under pressure, became a testament to their shared commitment to making the world a better place for everyone. The story of Sandra's flight and Michael's subsequent advocacy efforts continued to resonate with people across the country. The impact of their experience led to tangible changes, with the airline involved issuing a formal apology and announcing plans to overhaul their customer service training programs. Other companies, inspired by the public reaction, began to follow suit, recognizing the need for greater inclusivity and respect in their interactions with customers. Sandra and Michael's story became a rallying cry for those fighting against everyday discrimination, serving as a reminder of the power of personal stories to drive social change. Michael continued to use his platform to advocate for equality, while Sandra, though more comfortable out of the spotlight, remained a quiet force of support and inspiration behind the scenes. Their journey had not been easy, but it had been meaningful. Sandra knew that while the flight had been a painful experience, it had also opened doors to important conversations and actions that might not have happened otherwise. She was proud of how she and Michael had turned a negative situation into a catalyst for positive change. As they continued their work, Sandra and Michael remained committed to their cause, knowing that the fight for equality was ongoing. Their story and the impact it had served as a testament to the strength of character and the importance of standing up for what is right. It was a call for change that echoed far beyond the confines of a single flight, touching the lives of many and inspiring others to join the movement for a more just and equitable world.